All right, this is Shannon B. Douglas. Once again, Harbourfront, Toronto. I think this is going to be my last video today because my train leaves in less than an hour, and I've been a bit verbose, shooting some longer thoughts than I normally do. Um, and I wanted to talk about, okay, so this is while we were asleep. And if you've been following me, I traveled across Canada this year. I spent 5 weeks in British Columbia and Alberta. I did a daily video talking about the state of our world, I think, and where we are, where we might be going, some of the problems that I think we're facing, and some of the symptoms of those problems that people are experiencing in their lives. And I wanted to share a little bit today because I'm running for Ottawa School Board Trustee, Zone 3, Rideau Rockcliffe or Rideau Vanier. And it's going to be an ugly race. And I want to generate a conversation. I want to have a conversation with people. And I think that my experience in my life leads me to this position where I'm the right candidate for this job. I'm 51 years old. And I hate talking about this. I find it gauche. And it should be my own business and no one else's. But we wear our victimizations on our sleeves these days. I'm a adult survivor of childhood narcissistic abuse. My father was a physical, psychological, emotional abuser. He was a narcissist. He practiced creating false realities. He was a gaslight expert, denial of actual reality in favor of the reality that he wanted to impose on the world. And for a long time, that cost me a lot of problems. For a long time, I was bitter, I was angry. I went through a long period of catharsis, being furious at that. Why was I the victim of this? And I planted trees in northern British Columbia for 5 years. I planted just shy of 400,000 trees, as a matter of fact. So when I think about my carbon footprint for my lifetime, I perhaps have made better progress than other people thus far. But tree planting is a repetitive activity. It's mindless. And you have to get into a zone, and you do it 10, 11, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. You get 1.5 days off every week or 10 days to go and do your laundry, buy some whiskey and some marijuana, and go back to the camp. And I processed a lot of that grief and a lot of that pain and a lot of that suffering through that process of just being an angry young man. And I found myself at a certain point. I was in the creative writing department at the University of British Columbia in the late 90s. And I asked a question. I met a guy, George Mann. He's a Nisga'a traditional storyteller and carver. And I asked him a question about a vision quest, which led me to explore the idea of who am I and what is my purpose, which I think is one of the biggest, most profound questions a human being can ever ask. And that led me to a healing circle. Now, this healing circle was established and run by, developed by a psychologist, a well-known one, as a matter of fact, who I won't name. But this was an encounter weekend with intense 5 days of life skills training and processing some of those limiting beliefs and scripts that we have, and buried angers and frustrations, and like very, very intensive, like big pop kind of life transformational moments. And about 30% of the people in that program were Indigenous survivors of residential schools. This was in 1997. And in the 90s, there had already been some budget and some federal support for survivors of Indigenous residential schools to get help and to help process some of those and integrate some of those. And this was one of the programs that attracted a lot of people from, Nichanalooth, Vancouver Island, that's Port Alberni, and Cowichan Nation, Duncan, Vancouver Island, Shuswap territory. There were people from Squamish Nation, associated closer to Vancouver, and Tsawwassen. And being in that environment And this wasn't okay. It was 5 days, and then there was a follow up a month later, and a follow up a month later, and there was a fellowship involved in this. And I'm still friends with some of those people. Um, because about a third of those people were survivors of Indigenous residential schools, I heard directly in that environment and following as I did research and travel, survivor stories of residential schools. And Alberni School on Vancouver Island was one of the worst, most toxic and frightening schools uh, in the IRS system. And I heard in those days rumors of graves in Kelowna. And uh, from there, I I was invited to travel, and I traveled through Western Canada, the United States, meeting with um, Indigenous traditionals, storytellers, elders, and the storytellers and elders are a different cohort in the Indigenous communities, and many people don't realize because we think about Indigenous people, Indigenous nations as kind of this behemoth, as this block of people with sort of a one idea of the way the world is, and there is conflict and strife within the Indigenous communities. There are the politicals, the band council people. Okay, so band council were the structures that the federal government set up through the Indian Act, and they went into Indigenous communities and they bribed and they cajoled, and part of the destruction of Indigenous culture, part of the policy of interrupting the intergenerational bonds of trust between grandparents, parents, and children was to take away the authority and leadership from the elders who had held that since the beginning of time, and to empower band councils uh, with power, with money, with possessions, with influence, with status, to usurp or take away the power of the traditional elders and storytellers. And that was a practice that happened all over North America. So when we think of Indigenous communities, it's important to recognize that there are numerous different ideological groups within Indigenous society and amongst all of the nations, because there are, I don't know how many nations there are on Turtle Island, um, but each nation is unique and distinct. So there were some common themes that, because I was working with traditionals, not band council people, not politicians, not bureaucrats, but I was meeting actual people who were keepers of wisdom who had managed to, like, incredible means. In one case, I learned, and this wasn't isolated, but I live in Ottawa, Anishinaabe, Kittiganzibi lands, and um, elder grandfather William Commanda, who passed a number of years ago, he was internationally known. He knew Nelson Mandela. He made a contribution in terms of wisdom. I learned through studying him, and very fortunate to meet him on one occasion, um, about secret societies that the Indigenous, the Red Nation, managed to form in order to protect their knowledge and language and culture. And they did that because of encroachment and because of the policies of the Indian Act and because of the threats to those sacred ways and those sacred stories. And so they created these secret societies where they weren't allowed to speak their language. Drumming and dancing was prohibited for decades. There was all kinds of structures in place designed by a previous government generations ago to try and take away the culture of Indigenous people. And so they formed these secret societies in order to do that. And I'm sure that that happened elsewhere as well. Now, one of the common themes that I heard and came to as I was traveling, and as I was traveling in British Columbia just this year, went to visit my friend George in the Nass Valley, was a wisdom that is familiar and consistent in all nations of the world. And the very nature and structure of one of the central symbols of Indigenous tradition is the medicine wheel. And the medicine wheel, if you're familiar with it, I'm going to post a picture. I don't normally edit these videos like this, but the medicine wheel is a circle. And I'm sure you've seen it because we often see it embedded within a dream catcher or with a couple of iconic feathers hanging from it. It's a circle that is divided into four quadrants. And the four quadrants are red, black, yellow, and white. And, circles are universal symbols. And we see religious or spiritual iconography in archaeology. Pre-Roman Europe, European tribes, Celtic tribes occupied all of Europe before the Empire of Rome, France, Portugal, uh, Spain, uh, and they had a circle. They had stone circles, as a matter of fact. But the four core colors of their tradition were red, black, yellow, and white. And if you're watching this, at some point in history, your ancestors were connected to the earth and to the seasons like this. The four quadrants of the medicine wheel represent the four directions: north, south, east, and west. Or, if you tell it in proper order, east, south, west, and north. And it's a memory device for telling stories. Now, I'm sharing this because this is publicly available information. I'm not appropriating anybody's stories, and I'm sharing with you that these aren't unique to the people of Turtle Island who survive today, but perhaps they're among the last traditional knowledge keepers of the earth that we have, who keep these memories and keep these stories. So I was told by people from more than one nation, wisdom keepers, that those four colors, red, black, yellow, and white, represent the four nations of the earth: the red nation, the black nation, the yellow nation, and the white nation. And that the rainbow represents the spectrum of humanity. Not the rainbow that we have today is the rainbow flag, if we're thinking about gender, but rainbow in a sense, uh, well, there's, because the number seven is sacred. Um, Seven being the seven generations. And Indigenous cultures and knowledge keepers from around the world recognize that in our lifetime. So I knew my great grandfather. I knew my grandparents. I of course knew my parents, and I have children. So if we think of that, my great grandparents were generation one, and the first generation that I would know in my life. My grandparents the second, my parents the third. I'm the fourth generation. The children that come after me are the fifth generation. The children that my children have, sixth generation, and their children, seventh generation. Now, we've changed the way, as a species, that we reproduce. We've altered our biochemistry, used birth control methods, we've delayed the age with at which we traditionally start families. And so it's doubtful for me that I would know two generations beyond my children, unless I live to 125. But that seven generation knowledge and that seven generation thinking was a model and a tool for making decisions, ecological decisions. I kind of like that word for this. Ecological means that when we're making decisions, we're considering all my ancestors and the wisdom that they've imparted and the experience that they've shared with us and the lessons and the memories that they have. And I'm making decisions that I know are going to impact my kids and their kids and the kids after them. Now, we as a species have forgotten seven generation thinking. And when we were all Indigenous people at one point, perhaps in the recent past or in the very distant past, thousands of years ago, we thought this way because in order to preserve knowledge, we used oral tradition. And those stories had to be passed down for those seven generations. And so the medicine wheel has been passed down for generation and generation and generation. And the stories of the four nations are integrative stories. The wheel is the universe. It's all of humanity. And when we think about the medicine wheel, and William Commanda, grandfather Commanda, shared this story. I was in a group of people. And he shared this, and I'm sure he shared it many, many times. He commonly said, I am you, and you are me. And he closed his prayer with all my relations, meaning all people of humanity. And when he shared this idea of I am you and you are me, he was sharing a common theme that exists in religions and spiritual traditions from around the world. And we hear it and we understand it in words like namaste, which means I greet the divinity in you in a sacred greeting. The word shalom means the same thing. There's a Sanskrit term, tat tvam asi. And the philosopher Alan Watts says, you're it. But it means thou art that the world out there is just an extension of who I am. And so if we want to preserve relationships and preserve harmony and maintain dignity and carry stories and survive those stories for generations and generations, these are the values that as human beings are among the very highest. It's the root of compassion. Buddha said similar things. Confucius, Kung Fu Tzu, said similar things. As much as 2,700 years ago, some of the first instances of the structure that we know as the Golden Rule, that what I do unto you, I also do unto me, and has consequences. And we've lost this somehow and for some reason. We're not thinking in these terms anymore. We're not thinking, and maybe we never did, not collectively. We're in a state of society today where we're dividing people against people based on their race. And what I learned from those elder traditionals and those storytellers, I'll borrow the word shaman from Siberian tradition, the medicine people, is that we are all one love. That's Bob Marley, right? We're all one. But now we're divided, and we're dividing. And the people divided and dividing are stealing. You know, I was concerned about getting accused of cultural appropriation for making a video like this, and it's quite possible that those name callers will attack me that way. I learned when I was traveling as a young white man, long braided hair, I was concerned that because of the trauma and the history, that I would be rejected by the people that uh, I was a sidekick on a journey, and I was worried that I I wasn't worthy, or that my presence would upset or offend or hurt people. But in fact, it was the opposite. And what people told me time and time again was that when you approach these questions, you approach these stories, you approach these people and relationships, and come honestly from the heart, they will they will always welcome you. And my home is always open to people who come with open hearts. I am you and you are me. All my relations.